back to American Lit. Today, we are on session 24 out of 31 sessions total. For more information, for class materials, you need to go visit www.thelmaslibrary.com. All materials are free. Teacher materials will have to be sent to you from me, since I don't want to post teacher materials online. But all the quizzes, exams, note sets, handouts, things like that are all available for free. This is designed primarily for Christian home educators. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we pray that we could be instrumental in this world that you have created. We appreciate all of the natural laws, and we pray for all the scientists who are looking to explore this world and learn more about our world. And we pray that they could open their eyes and all see as they look through creations, as Romans 1 says, to see through the creation and see the Creator in this creation. We thank you so much for the privilege of home education. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Let's get going here. Our devotion, go ahead, pause for your devotion, have someone read a selection from the Valley of Vision. If you haven't printed these samples yet, or don't have a copy of the Valley of Vision, we read from this every week. And just pause the video and have your volunteer read a devotion, please. Okay, we're back. Schedule review. This is session 24. This is the end of the third quarter. We have 8-week quarters, so 8 times 4 is 32. Session 24, end of the third quarter. This is time to take home. Either you're doing your exam in class, possibly last week, maybe this week, your teacher or facilitator may tweak the exam a little bit to make it fit you, because the exam I wrote that I last used a year or 2 ago may not completely fit your needs, and you have my permission to make that exam fit your class. But this can be either done in class and then you kind of rush through some slides or skip some, or you can send this home stapled, folded and stapled, and ask a parent to proctor that. It is a closed book exam, so you're not allowed use of your materials, just your brain. We're continuing today with Huck Finn. There is no quiz today. I know your schedule says there is a quiz, the student schedule, but there is no quiz today. We have too many, doing a quiz and an exam is, don't worry, there will be enough questions in the exam on Huck Finn that we'll know if you finished reading Huck Finn. We'll be looking at Emily Dickinson a little bit, talking about that house divided speech again, because it is so important, and learn what the A.M.E. was. And we'll take a peek at the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, and a little bit about literary realism. Your reading this week is to finish Huck Finn. Yes, Huck Finn should be underlined. It's a book title, sorry. You're going to finish Huck Finn, which in the Dover edition is pages 165 to 220. No syllabus reading this week, and your writing is to finish your paper. Remember, it's due next session. Your paper is due next session, and your paper, as it was assigned, was a character study, a plot study, or a theme study. If you've already written a character study and a plot study, your teacher may ask you to write a theme study, or vice versa. It's good to try all of the papers. Of course, you have to have 2 or more quotes from the text. Theme study, 3 or more quotes, because you need to to quote from our text to prove the theme. And the word count does not include the quotes. So you look at your word count, you highlight the entirety of your paper, and then your word processor will tell you the very bottom line how many words you've highlighted, and you count those, and then you highlight each of your quotes, add up that number of words that are in your total amount of quotes, and then subtract that from your total words, and you have your word count. And you need to do that for me, because I may, or your teacher may, just see the printed copy of your paper. If you do not write down your word count, I've always subtracted 5%. That's half a letter grade. If I have to count the words in your paper, it's going to cost you half a letter grade. That's just the way it is. Learn to do it. It's essential. And so you make a note, so many words, not including quotes. These word counts are very low, and they are a minimum. So you're welcome to write double that. Most people will write about double the word count, but this is a minimum. If you write below that word count, you're in the D range, and it better be an A plus paper to get a D if you have a small word count. Next week, be sure and bring your copy of Great American Short Stories. It's that Dover edition from the book list in session 1. Bring that next week. Bring a pen or a highlighter or something so that you can mark your book as we go along. So next week, you're going to turn in, this is next week, you'll turn in your Huck Finn paper, you'll turn in your exam unless you did it last week, and you'll have a quiz over the last of Huck Finn. Yep. All right, reading next week is those Great American Short Stories, and we'll be reading from 101 Great Poems. At some of these poems we have read aloud in class, but a poem becomes more real to you the more times you hear it or read it. So don't think, oh no, she accidentally assigned this again. We read some of these poems over and over so that we understand these very famous, important poems. And there's syllabus reading assigned next week in case you're working ahead. I'm going to average your Huck Finn scores to fill in this spot on your grade form. There is a spot for the Huck Finn quiz today, and I'll just average your other Huck Finn quiz scores. So if you've done well, you'll do well. If you've done poorly, you will do poorly. It's the way it goes. All right, American poets, let's take another peek at Emily Dickinson. You can see that she lived till just after the Civil War. Imagine what the end of her life was like those last few years. The Civil War was what years? Yes, 1861 to 65, 4 years across 5 Aprils. Dickinson is one of America's most important poets. Her use of the English language and form have a distinctive style, and that's why she's famous. She uses irregular rhythm and meter. She doesn't follow all the rules. She often speaks directly to her reader. Remember, Stowe did that? And she addresses simple but very profound topics like life and death. And of course, Mark Twain made fun of her because she talks about death, but she did indeed end up dying young. Her words search for meaning in a world where life is often too brief, but profound. And I would challenge you that to consider Emily Dickinson, that her life was also too brief, but profound. Someone who never married, never had children, lived mostly at home with her parents, suffered many great losses, and yet has a profound effect. Was not published in her lifetime, very much like Anne Bradstreet that way. She hid it all away. Dickinson writes of death. She writes about nature, spirituality with an easy acceptance. This is an Emily Dickinson museum photo. These are all replicas. That's a replica of her writing desk, a replica of her chair. Even the wallpaper is a big deal, a replica. At the museum, you can buy note cards with replica wallpaper, that flowered wallpaper. Note cards. It's really amazing how much influence she has had. It's kind of funny. And the white dress, although the portraits we see of her, she's in black, and we think of her as being very gloomy, she actually preferred white. And this is a replica of the only surviving dress that we have of Emily Dickinson. We're going back a long time. We're almost to 2030 in 2023. In 7 years, that dress is, well, it wasn't made when she was born, but this dress is 175 years old, the original. So it is stored away somewhere, I'm not sure. And these are things that are replicas. She lived as a recluse in her family home in Amherst, Massachusetts. She wrote almost 1,800 poems, relatively in isolation. Only a handful were published during her lifetime, very much like Anne Bradstreet, although more of hers than a handful were published. Her sister Lavinia found her poems after her death and then set about to get those all published. The first edition of Dickinson's work was published 4 years after her death, similar to Anne Bradstreet. I love this dress. I just have to say, I love this dress. I know I'm an old lady, but I have loved this style since I was a girl. This vintage kind of look, I've loved it. Her words are often few and very simple. She's searching for meaning. She's exploring death and immortality, And I would suggest that other than being consumed with death, that she's surrounded by death. She rarely left her home and was thought to prefer to wear white, since she was buried in white and her only surviving dress is white. She corresponded with friends, family, and other literary figures. And we're going to miss that today, aren't we? People don't write paper letters anymore. If you're viewing this and I'm still alive, I would love it if you send me a letter, not an email, not a text, but an actual handwritten letter. Letters are rare and valuable. I have a box of letters that students have written to me to tell me what a profound impact my classes have made on the rest of their education and on their worldview. And that means a lot to me, and it's more valuable than an email. You can print an email, I guess, but I never do. So if you want to talk to me, you can send me a letter. It's not too hard to find my address. So she corresponds on paper. Dickinson created her own small handmade books for her own use. She sometimes recycled envelopes on which she wrote poems. There's even a book edition. You can buy this at our museum. It's called the Envelope Poems. And these are poems that were written on the backs and all over the excess paper of the envelope. So she was a recycler before recycling. She didn't waste any paper. And she just wrote poems on these things. During her lifetime, Emily was better known for her baking than for her poems. She was extremely well educated, including a year in seminary. So she's well educated. Like other religious women of her day, she's well educated. She loved gardening, playing piano, singing, and her dog Carlos. Now, we think of her as being a complete recluse, but that's not true, especially in her earlier years with her education. She was out and about. She was at school. She was away from home at seminary for a year. She had male friends, and she had at least one proposal. We have evidence on paper, but she never married. Dickinson was often asked if her poems could be shared or made public, but she always refused. She did not want to be famous. She didn't want them shared. After the death of her parents, the death of her young 8-year-old nephew who died of typhoid fever, and then several other loved ones, she herself became ill, and then she never really fully recovered. Think of all the diseases people used to get. And I think if you kind of know you're sick, maybe you wouldn't marry. Maybe you'd think you don't want to be a mother and have your children have their mother die young. Who knows what was going on her mind? Letters in a collection called Letters from Dickinson. Some of these you can find online. Most of these you still have to buy a book. And she says, would it be of any use to ask you once more for one or two of your poems to come out in the volume of no-name poetry? So this is someone who wants to, this is someone requesting if they could publish her poem. And he says, would it be of any use to ask you once more for one or two of your poems to come out in the volume of no-name poetry, which is to be published before long by Robert Brothers? If you will give me permission, I will copy them, sending them in my own handwriting, and promise never to tell anyone, not even the publishers, whose the poems are. Could you not bear this much of publicity? Only you and I would recognize the poems. And of course, she said no. From the museum, I just think these pictures are beautiful. So it looks like she had a sleigh bed. These are all reproductions. And you can see the beautiful, probably mahogany or cherry dresser with inlaid pieces of other types of wood that are absolutely gorgeous. I love this photo. And here is the piano. We know that she loved to play piano and that she sang. This is a generous size living room. You can imagine she and her parents or any company or family visiting here. And then this is her burial. I think this is really well said. Emily Dickinson, born December 10, 1830, called back May 15, 1886. Called back. I like that on a headstone. Hope is the thing with feathers. I want to introduce you to a poem. This is in our Dover text. If you have 101 Great American poems with you, 101 Great American Poems. I don't know if you can read it. You can kind of, and I think your cover might vary from mine because mine is quite old and they change the covers all the time over at Dover. And the little picture here is actually something you can buy at Etsy. That is hand done with a little hand painted bird, but that might give you an idea of something that you could do as a project. So here's our poem. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me. Somehow they get their food. Although that poem always makes me think, well, you should put a little bit of seed out on your windowsill. And because I could not stop for death. And I realize this one might be getting old to you, but now after the last 5 minutes, do you think differently of this picture of Emily Dickinson? Do you think differently of this photograph? Here she's dressed in black, but now you know she may have preferred white, although maybe she was just buried in white, and maybe the dress that survives is white because it's the one she didn't wear. We don't know. It's amazing how people try to make so much of so little with our own ideas. But because I could not stop for death, and I'm going to present to you again, perhaps she's not so gloomy, perhaps she's just realistic. And I wanted to present this poem to you again today, mostly because I've received some artwork from a present student. I have a student, Levi Lewis, who did this image on his computer. And when we read the poem, when he took American Lit a couple of years ago, he had an idea for an image. And because death is personified to be a gentleman, and of course, this is computer generated. And in this poem, death is portrayed as a leisurely journey with a calm acceptance. The listener can kind of feel her progression to a chilliness in the air after the sun sets. She speaks of centuries like she's been dead for a long time. And although she lived to be 55, she was a Christian who never married, and she does seem to be preoccupied with death. Is she? Or is she just preoccupied with all of the loss that she suffers? I know that for myself, the only time that I have written anything worthy as a poem is when we have suffered great loss, when we have been under a real trial, a time of turmoil. And that's when I wrote my best poetry. And so is she preoccupied with death, or did the loss that she suffered just simply force her to reach out and express her heart on paper? You'll have to think about that because we don't know. Fewer than 10 poems were published in her lifetime. Because I could not stop for death. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the rain. We passed the fields of grazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews grew quivering and chill, for only gossamer, my gown, my tippet, only tulle. So she's not dressed very warm at all. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice but a mound. What is that? It's a grave, and it's a house. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet each feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Oh, beautiful poem, beautiful poem. Did you enjoy that more today than last week or the week before, whenever I introduced it to you first? Okay, what about Lincoln's House divided speech? I don't want you to forget this, and I realize this is repetitive, but some things we have to repeat. The title comes from a sentence in the speech's introduction: a house divided cannot against itself stand. A house divided against itself cannot stand. And that paraphrases a statement by Jesus, of course, in the New Testament, Matthew 12:25. And the speech: Mr. President and gentlemen of the convention, if we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it. I know this is just from last week. I want this to become familiar to you. We are now far into the 5th year. Remember, the Civil War was across 5 Aprils, 4 years, since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation. Under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. In my opinion, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached and passed. A house divided against itself cannot stand. All right, I'm going to quit there. Lincoln believed that the recent Supreme Court decision on the Dred Scott case was part of a Democratic conspiracy that would lead to the legalization of slavery in all states. Referring to the court's decision that permitted Dred Scott to live in a free state and yet be a slave, he said, what Dred Scott's master might lawfully do with Dred Scott in the free state of Illinois, every other master may lawfully do with any other one or 1,000 slaves in Illinois or in any other free state. He is just dreading the spread of slavery. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. That's what he is afraid of. Stephen Douglas, his opponent, would twist Lincoln's meaning and portray him as a warmonger and a radical abolitionist. But as part of Lincoln's legacy, that House divided speech marked the point at which Abraham Lincoln, local politician, firmly planted his stake. He drew his line there in the ground and on a highly charged national issue. Okay, you know Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president. You know he died April 15th, 1865. He was elected in 1860. He served through the Civil War through 1864, but died April 15th. Then the Civil War dates, which you have memorized by now, and you must always have them memorized, 1861 to 1865. And then you know Lincoln was assassinated April 15, 1865 at Ford's Theater. You can still go to the Smithsonian Institute and actually see the chair, blood-soaked, and Lincoln's jacket, a few items from that evening. And this is an artist portrayal of mourning Lincoln, because it did take him, I don't remember if it was a few hours or a day or so to die, but they knew he was going to die. When you're shot in the head, very few survive in 1865. And the 14th Amendment, remember that. Go to syllabus page 130, follow along for the next 10 or so slides. That amendment was passed to give freed slaves citizenship and civil liberties. This is 1867. So this is 2 years after the Civil War. This is a big deal. Most Southern states just refused to ratify that amendment. So it got imposed by further legislation. They had to, those Democratic states really had to be forced to comply. And the 1867 Reconstruction Act, so they're going to reconstruct the South. Everybody's going to go together and pay taxes to reconstruct the South, which lost the war and was just devastated, just destroyed. I won't say decimated because it gets overused today, and decimated means it means 10% was destroyed, and it was much worse than that. So it allowed readmission to the Union by Southern states only after they would ratify that 14th Amendment. And by now you've got syllabus page 130 open. If you don't know what the syllabus is, it's a 400-some page giant PDF document available at Thelma's library, at thelmaslibrary.com, and it would be in American Lit Session 1. It's a giant PDF file meant to be printed front and back and hole punched and put into a 3-ring binder. So syllabus, page 130. Now, the 14th Amendment is a crucial amendment to our Constitution that was adopted 1868, right after the Civil War, and it's got several really important provisions. For example, citizenship. The amendment defines who is a citizen of the United States, and it says anyone born or naturalized. That meant that these slaves, anybody born in America, was a citizen. And we use that now for, say someone comes illegally into the United States and then they have a baby. That baby is a citizen because they're born here in America. They're a citizen by the 14th Amendment. Sometimes they call those anchor babies. People come here illegally and then purposely have children, or have children because they're young couples, and then they have a baby. And what are you going to do? Deport the parents and leave the baby? It gets really tricky. Talk about that with your mom and dad and see what's the answer to that. Also, due process. That's part of the 14th Amendment. It provides no state can deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So the government has to allow fair procedures before taking away somebody's life, liberty, or property. So you couldn't make a slave unless they had due process, go into court and prove. And of course, the court would now say slavery is illegal. You can't, they used to use that for life, liberty, or property. And think about this with abortion. You can't deprive any person of life. Is an unborn child a person? If they're a person, then the 14th Amendment applies to them. Things get tricky. Also, equal protection. The amendment guarantees equal protection of the law to everybody. But remember, they said the southern states decided they would be equal but separate. You took notes there on syllabus page 130 at the 14th Amendment. You took notes. I had you highlight things. The 14th Amendment was enacted to protect the civil rights of African Americans who were previously enslaved and were still facing discrimination and segregation. They were being treated like not just second-class citizens. They weren't even being treated like citizens. They were being treated like they were animal, because they had been treated like animal, like cattle or horses that you could buy and sell and brand and trade and divide up families just as though they were animals. And who are we going to blame for that for the rest of eternity? Charles Darwin. The amendment was also intended to provide a legal basis for the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which had been passed by Congress, but they were still challenging it in the courts. The 14th Amendment has been instrumental in providing equal protection and due process of law to minority groups in the United States ever since. The amendment's provisions have been used to protect the rights of various groups, and that would include applying the 14th Amendment not just to African Americans, but applying it to women, applying it to I should have written LGBTQ plus individuals, and applying it to immigrants, that everybody gets equal protection, because LGBTQ plus, they are also citizens. And so equal protection to people who, cross-dress. That's what we used to say, cross-dressers. And now they're called trans, but they used to be just cross-dressers, guys who like to wear dress up like women, and women who like to dress up like men. But those equal, the 14th Amendment has now been applied to them. For example, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment has been used to strike down laws that discriminate against minorities. Now, who gets to be a minority? That's the key thing here. Now, in the landmark case, Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, 1952. So I was 5 years old at that time. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional because it violated the Equal Protection Clause. And remember what the South did? They said equal but separate. Now, that was a really good application of it, wasn't it? Of the 14th Amendment. That was an excellent application. That's what it was all about. We go way back to 1867, 68, and here we are in 1952, almost 100 years later, and they keep having to apply this law and try to press this law so that these poor dark-skinned kids can go to a good school. But then If you apply that, once you start applying that to everybody, somebody beyond African-American slaves, what about Obergefell versus Hodges, 2015, only 8 years ago? The Supreme Court ruled that that equal protection clause requires states to allow same-sex couples to marry. So what do you think about that with the 14th Amendment? Are gay people a minority? Well, there are fewer of them than other people. So in that way, they are a minority, but are they really a protected minority group? And if you treat them like they're a protected minority group, if you allow a minority group to be based on people's sexual preferences, and that's why 8 years ago, things started going crazy. The Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment has been used to protect minority rights. So who's a minority? For example, in Roe versus Wade, back 1973, when I was your age in high school, the Supreme Court ruled that a woman has a constitutional right to an abortion because the Due Process Clause protects her right to privacy. What do you think about that ruling? Ever since 1973, we've had judges, Supreme Court justices saying, that doesn't make sense. That's not logical. I keep telling you, logic is the answer to romanticism. That's not logical. That the Due Process Clause protects her right to privacy, and her right to privacy means you can't tell her what to do if she's pregnant with a human baby. What do you think about that? Yeah, ask your mom and dad. Since Roe versus Wade was decided in 1973, I wish you could see me talking with my hands. I talk with my hands, even though I'm just talking into my camera here. When it was decided in 1973, there have been many efforts to overturn it, but it remains the law of the land. I'm really sorry that I didn't change that to ED. This was before 2022, but it remained the law of the land. The key arguments to overturn Roe versus Wade typically come to those who oppose abortion on moral or religious grounds, like you and me. These arguments often focus on the following points. The right to life. Opponents of Roe versus Wade argued that a fetus has the right to life and that abortion is a violation of that right. They argue that the state has an obligation to protect the life of an unborn. Do you agree with that or disagree? The state has an obligation to protect the life of the unborn. Well, yes. Okay, the state's interest. Some opponents argue that the state has a legitimate interest in regulating abortion in order to protect the health and safety of women and the unborn. They believe that the states should have the right to regulate or ban abortion as they see fit. That's the state. And that's the way our Constitution is set up, isn't it? Anything not mentioned directly in the Constitution or an amendment is up to the states to decide. The concept of viability. Some opponents argue that the concept of viability, which was established in Roe versus Wade as the point at which a fetus becomes capable of surviving outside the womb, is arbitrary and outdated. Yes, from 1973, think of scientific advances. They argue that advances in medical technology have made it possible for premature babies to survive at earlier states of development, and therefore the concept of viability should be reevaluated. Yes, I was married in 1977, and then in 1980, I had my first live birth. There were no ultrasounds available to see if you had a boy or a girl, or find out exactly how old the baby was, or any of those things in the 70s. That all needs to be reevaluated. And the idea of federalism. Some opponents of Roe versus Wade argue that the decision was an overreach of federal power and that the issue of abortion should be left to the states to decide. And that is probably the majority Christian opinion. The issue of abortion should be left to the states. Let the states decide and vote on it. Are we going to have abortion or not abortion? Of course, abortion is morally wrong and should be outlawed, but by the laws of America, it should be left to the states to decide. Now, arguments in overturning Roe versus Wade, because it was overturned in 2022. The Supreme Court on Friday, and this is an article from June 24, 2022. This article isn't even a year old at the time of making this video. The Supreme Court on Friday issued its final opinion in a case that overturns Roe versus Wade, the ruling that has given women the constitutional right to an abortion for nearly 50 years. In delivering the opinion of the court's conservative majority, Justice Samuel Alito wrote that the 1973 Roe decision was egregiously wrong and on a collision course with the Constitution from the day it was decided. If you read his opinion, which it only takes an hour or two to read the entire opinion, it's about 70 pages if you get rid of all the footnotes. It's worth reading that they were egregiously wrong and on a collision course with the Constitution from the day it was decided. And I would agree. His arguments were also made in a draft opinion that was publicly leaked in May. I read the entire thing and it didn't change much. An unprecedented breach that has galvanized abortion rights supporters and their anti-abortion opponents. They still have not, they say they're looking for who leaked that opinion, but they're never going to tell us because that person is looked on as a hero by liberals and people who want abortions because they want to change politics by leaking things like that that might damage politicians. It's really amazing. It's worth reading because basically they say, you know, it's only back in 1973, he said it had only been a few years that people even accepted the idea that you would kill an unborn child. And to say that the founding fathers intended that that would be a right for everyone it just shows that you haven't read the Constitution and you know nothing of history, that the history of our country has always supported unborn children. It's quite a document if you take time to read that. Legal experts say the language in the official version doesn't significantly diverge from Alito's draft. As I just said, I read the draft. I read the draft the day it came out. I found it online and I read it the day it came out. While the justices voted 6-3 to uphold a Mississippi law banning abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy, because that was the case overturning it, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote in a separate concurring opinion that he does not support the full repeal of abortion rights. In their dissent, the High Court's 3 liberal wing justices, Stephen Breyer, Elena Kagan, and Sonia Sotomayor, took aim at the majority's draconian ruling as a decision that will curtail women's rights and their status as free and equal citizens. Are you really going to make those women have babies? How draconian is that? Amazing. Without regard to, well, we're not talking about just one person here. There are 2 people involved in abortion. There are 2 American citizens involved in every abortion. Okay, that was a great article. I think I read to the end of that, didn't I? No. Okay, let's see. In their dissent, it'll curtail women's rights and their status as free and equal citizens. I did read the rest of that. I love this political cartoon. There's Alito cutting down Roe versus Wade as the swing vote. Interesting, isn't it? Okay, back to Huck Finn and the antebellum South. And this is important because slavery is pretty much the same as abortion, isn't it? Slavery says that this person has no rights and you are the owner and you can do whatever you want with them. And that's what abortion is with women, that this unborn child is a blob of cells. And we know scientifically now in 2023, that's not true at all. But we act like it's only one person in that decision, that it's just a woman's decision. This is her body. She can do whatever she wants with her body. If she wants to cut off her leg, she can cut off her leg. And actually that argument doesn't work very well because you would be hard pressed to find a doctor who would be willing to cut off your leg without reason. But the idea that the baby is nothing, that the baby has no rights, that the baby isn't a baby. And so it really is the same argument as slavery. The idea that the slave doesn't matter at all. It's something you bought. You own this person. You can do whatever you want with them. And that is the same as the unborn child. The idea that the child has no rights, the child is not a person, that the child, you can do whatever you want with this child, however late you want. You can go up to the day before birth and kill this child. That is just presuming that the child is not a person. And how can you scientifically in 2023 say that an unborn baby is not a person? It's illogical. And that's why I always say logic is the cure for postmodernity. Okay, our story, Huck Finn, is set in 1852 in pre-war antebellum Missouri. Now, Twain lives in the post-war era of Reconstruction, but he writes as though it's pre-war. And rebuilding the nation, we know the South rejects integration. They just don't want to do it. Black people have been their slaves forever, and they're just not ready to shop for groceries with Black people and go to school with Black people and play chess with Black people and play, sports, baseball with Black people. They're just not able. They're just unable, and it's being forced down their throat. So post-war Reconstruction, enforced integration. We're going to make you integrate. If you want to join the union and you want all these dollars for Reconstruction to help build after you've lost the war and we destroyed all your buildings, you got to integrate. And Jim Crow laws basically stripped away these forced integration. It's just the South stubbornly saying, no, you can't do it. And what was their argument? Syllabus page 130 in your copy of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment. Equal but separate. Equal but separate. Okay, the A.M.E. Church, I mentioned them again. The American Methodist Episcopal Church. Don't you just love it that it's the church? So in 1816, in Philadelphia, you have free African Americans forming this new Wesleyan denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And this is one of the oldest ones. It's a historically African American denomination. A lot of white people go there too, but historically it was African American and congregation founded, this one founded in 1787 in Philadelphia. I have two different dates there. Apologies for my poor research. It's the oldest independent Protestant denomination in the United States that was founded by Black people. In Philadelphia in 1816, African Americans formed a new Wesleyan denomination. And I have duplicate slides there. I apologize for that. The church was initially known as the Free American African Society, and its founders were Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, and other Black leaders who were concerned with providing social and economic support for their communities. The group eventually formed a church congregation, which became the African Methodist Episcopal Church. There, I've got the church. Their founders were former slaves who had been active in the Methodist Church, but had been forced to sit in segregated areas. So in the back, and were not allowed to preach or hold leadership positions. They're just in the back. In response, they formed their own denomination, which emphasized the importance. And I think these three things are really important: education, self-reliance, and community empowerment. So for example, community empowerment, getting together and making their own church, that they would have, then they could have Sunday school, they could have choirs, they could have church socials, they could have all of those things. Intercommunications to learn about jobs and things like that. So education, self-reliance, and community empowerment. Those are really American values. Over the years, the famed church, F is now part of the acronym, has played an important role in the African American community and has been a leader in the struggle for civil rights and equal opportunity. It's also been active in providing social services and education programs to its members and the wider community. Today, this church has congregations all over America and even around the world. They launched a major missionary effort after the Civil War, and they were a leading source of resistance to Jim Crow laws. God bless them forever. What about Jim Crow? Okay, by the late 1870s, Reconstruction was coming to an end. So we had, 15 years worth or so of reconstructing the South that had been destroyed by the North. It's all getting reconstructed. Now, what about those Jim Crow laws? In the name of healing the wounds between the North and the South, most white politicians abandoned the cause of protecting African Americans. So African Americans were forced to fight on their own for their own causes. This deplorable void, lack of help, forced uneducated Blacks to struggle for many years. But that A.M.E. church focus on education, self-reliance, and community empowerment, kind of the American values, enabled many to rise above their circumstances. Now we're going to switch gears here and talk about the Underground Railroad for just a little bit. I found a really good map of the Underground Railroad. Of course, you notice all these paths are going north, except these ones going to Florida. Pretty much everybody's heading north. They're all looking to go to Canada or somewhere free. The Underground Railroad began as small individual or group efforts to help slaves escape their situations. Nobody knows the exact time or the people to label as the first to help slaves escape because it was all done in secrecy. But the Quaker abolitionists get the most press in history, and the Quakers, just awesome people, God bless them. In the early 1800s, this Quaker guy, Isaac T. Hopper, set up an escape network in Philadelphia to help enslaved people on the run. Quakers in North Carolina were also finding groups of willing people to help fugitive enslaved people to get further north toward freedom. You just had to find who was willing to help. You had to talk politics with them a little bit, talk religion with them a little bit, and find out if this family thought slavery was horrid or thought slavery was a foundational right that they had. And those who were sympathetic towards slaves might be willing to help you. And all of these helpers to collectively get called the Underground Railroad. There's no tunnels with a train on it underground. This is just a metaphor. These groups provided directions, food and clothing, and other necessities for travelers. Because think about it, you need money, you need better clothes. Slaves had horrible clothes. They had no direction. Most of them couldn't read. They didn't even know where to go. So they really needed help to escape. The A.M.E. was another religious group helping fugitive enslaved people. Eventually, this movement gained the name the Underground Railroad because the way they quickly hustled people along the way. In 1839, one poor soul named Jim revealed under torture that he was following an underground railroad to Boston. So eventually you've got the bad people trying to figure out how on earth are they doing this. There were also vigilantes who created groups to protect these fugitives from bounty hunters because there were people looking for fugitive slaves and they would bounty hunters. They would get money for finding them. Just like there are bounty hunters today looking for fugitives from the law, not from slavery, but from the law, criminals. Where there is injustice, there is often a Christian willing to suffer to bring about change, and they found people to help them. Those enslaved people in the Deep South on plantations rarely had access to groups who could help them escape. Just like on Legree's plantation in Uncle Tom's Cabin, there are no helpers there. Unless you were able to get to town there just weren't any helpers. And that's why there was such a fear. And in Huck Finn of Jim going south, very much a fear of going south because you're further and further away from any hope of rescue. This is why slaves like Uncle Tom or Jim are just so afraid of being sold downriver. Most of the enslaved people helped by the Underground Railroad escaped from those border states like Kentucky, Virginia, and Maryland. They were just closer to the north. In the Deep South, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 made capturing escaped enslaved people a lucrative business. And so we see people like Haley in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And there were fewer hiding places in the Deep South. Where are you going to hide? Fugitive enslaved people were typically on their own until they got to certain points farther north. The people guiding runaways were called conductors, just like on a train. They hid fugitives in their homes, in churches, schools, barns. These places became known as safe houses or stations on the railroad. There were many well-traveled routes heading toward New England or Canada, just like we saw in Uncle Tom's Cabin. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, that plays such a prominent role in the plot of Uncle Tom's Cabin, meant people helping along the Underground Railroad would be punished and treated as criminals. And now this is a really big deal. Will you help these people if you're going to get arrested and put in jail? It's very much like abortion today. Will you go stand, by the door and witness to people and try to block people from going into abortion clinics where you go to jail? And so they've determined a boundary, how many 100 feet you have to stay away from the abortion clinic or you're going to jail. And those laws meant that those who escaped as far as the north, they still weren't safe because of that Fugitive Slave Act. Fewer people were willing to help them. We're going to presume that. The law defended the masters, even across state lines. Once in Canada, there were networks of people and lots of groups who helped fugitives to settle in and find work. These refugees were free to live wherever they wanted, to apply for jobs. They could sit on journeys. They could even run for office in Canada. I don't know what was wrong here in America. Harriet Tubman was the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroads. Lots of books written about her. And so if you have more time to read, you should look her up and read some of her books. She and two of her brothers escaped a Maryland plantation in 1849. She came back to that same plantation a number of times to rescue her family members. Sadly, on her third trip to rescue her husband, she found that he had already remarried, and then he refused to leave. He didn't want the danger. Harriet claimed to have received a vision from God that gave her the strength to join the Underground Railroad and help other groups of slaves to escape to Canada. And she didn't trust the United States government. Who would blame her? But it's kind of cruel to think she had this vision that told her, that gave her that strength to just keep rescuing people. She became fearless in her mission to help slaves escape. She brought confidence with her knowledge of routes and conductors, everything to convince a slave to accompany her. Imagine someone who can't read or write, doesn't even know where they're at, has no map in their head, being willing to escape. This lady was powerful, powerful lady. We know Harriet made at least 13 missions, and she rescued at least 70 enslaved persons. She became known as the Moses of escaping slaves because she helped people escape slavery like Moses did from the Egyptians. During the Civil War of 1861 to 64, Harriet served as a nurse, she served as a cook, and she served as a spy for the Union Army. In her late 40s by this time, she led a military expedition in South Carolina that liberated more than 700 enslaved people. After the war, Tubman continued to fight for the rights of African Americans and women. And she was an advocate for suffrage, so women to vote and women to get education and Black people to get education. There is a new $20 bill. It's planned to be released in 2026. We'll see if they really do it. It's the 200th anniversary of Harriet Tubman's birth, and this bill will have Harriet's face replace Andrew Jackson. So we'll see if this really happens. So this image is, of course, an artist's idea of how that might take place. If you look on the internet for Harriet Tubman $20 bill, there are about 20 different ideas of what it might look like, but we'll see in 2026 if this really happens. Her focus on freedom, education, self-reliance, and community empowerment enabled her to rise above her circumstances. Isn't that amazing? The same values as the A.M.E. Freedom, then education, get educated, and then self-reliance. Nobody's going to help you along. You got to do it yourself. And then community empowerment, getting all together, build your own community. She really, what an amazing lady. Frederick Douglass, you know him by now. We read his biography. We read his most popular biography. The powerful, former fugitive slave Frederick Douglass settled in Rochester, New York. He helped more than 400 escapees pass through his own home as he aided the Underground Railroad. Can you imagine somebody knocking on his door and saying, do you have any slaves here? Can you imagine him? What a powerful man answering the door. I'm not sure you'd press him. Former fugitives who are now merchants, writers, and workers of various trades formed a vigilance committee in 1838. And Josiah Henson, he was the model for Uncle Tom's Cabin, and he created what it was called the Canadian Dawn Institute of 1842 to help people learn new skills, education, and self-reliance. I read a book about the Dawn Institute, and it supposedly was all about the real Uncle Tom. And in that book, they said that Uncle Tom killed one of his overseers. And that's when I realized that the author of that book didn't even read Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I left a scathing Amazon review. One conductor's death certificate listed his occupation, and that's what he wanted on his death certificate: Underground Railroad agent. John Parker, a free Black man in Ohio, used a rowboat to cross the Ohio River repeatedly to help fugitives, just in a rowboat. William Still, this is volume 3 of his Underground Railroad, William Still, kept a record of his activities, keeping it safely hidden until after the Civil War, and then published his account. And you can still, you can buy that and read it. Were all the conductors former slaves? No. Most conductors were just ordinary people like you and me. They were farmers, business owners, preachers, and a bunch of Quakers. One man, Garrett Smith, ran for president twice. He was a millionaire, purchasing an entire family one time to set them free, and was an Underground Railroad conductor. Kind of cool. Levi Coffin, a 15-year-old Quaker kid who hated the evil of slavery, began finding the hiding places that slaves used, and that he helped slaves escape for the rest of his life. Many abolitionists were captured and punished by hanging or imprisonment. Some had SS, for slave stealer, branded on their hands. So this was not without penalty. The Underground Railroad became an above-ground network in 1863 because the Civil War was raging on to its conclusion, and became part of the Union effort against the Confederacy. So the Union, if you had great-great-grandparents who fought for the Union side, they were helping those slaves escape also during the war. Martin Luther King, last week we read his I Have a Dream speech that was delivered in 1962 at the Lincoln Memorial. Very importantly, at the Lincoln Memorial, since Lincoln is the one who wanted to free slaves. And you have the text of his I Have a Dream speech in your syllabus, page 339. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover's leadership, conducted extensive surveillance on that Baptist minister, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the civil rights movement during the 1950s and 1960s. The FBI's interest in Dr. King began in the mid-1950s when he emerged as a leader of the highly successful Montgomery bus boycott. Remember, we talked about that last week? The bus boycott, and when all the Black people just didn't ride the bus, it really forced their hand, that they had the Black people were the main riders of the bus, and they weren't going to be treated like secondhand citizens. But in the 1950s, there was always a real hard search for anybody with communist sympathies. The FBI wrongly suspected Dr. King of having communist ties. And of course, none of that is true, but they chased a lot of famous people down trying to prove they were communist. Later in the early 1960s, the FBI increased their surveillance of King as he became more vocal in his opposition to the Vietnam War. So he started talking politics, and he began advocating for economic justice so that Black people would be paid the same as white people and be able to get jobs. Unfortunately, by wiretapping his phone conversations, trying to prove that he was a communist or just trying to find anything on him, they tapped his home and his hotel rooms. They also learned of his frequent infidelity to his wife, Coretta Scott. And this is the horrible part of what the FBI did. Despite Edgar Hoover's relentless efforts to prove otherwise, Dr. King was no communist. Despite tarnishing his personal reputation by exposing his aberrant sexual practices to his wife, Coretta stood behind her husband. Every time they told her, she just ignored it. She stood behind her man. And there were many, many. It's really sad, and I couldn't even present them in this class. And there are quotes that just say that was his big sin. That was his one big sin, but it does tarnish his reputation. His legacy is one of nonviolent social change. They just marched down the street, thousands and thousands. They didn't go around breaking windows. King's tireless advocacy and leadership were instrumental in the civil rights movement and contributed to the end of legal segregation in the United States. So he has this really important place in history. He said, "It takes empathy, patience, and compassion to overcome anger, hatred, and resentment." And I think that's just as true today as it was in the 1950s. Amazing, isn't it? Okay, in addition to your notes from last week, you've got structured notes for Huckleberry Finn. We said society tends to corrupt true morality, freedom, and justice that are taught in the Bible. Society tends to start corrupting that right away. Huck in this book has to follow his own conscience, and his conscience tells him slavery is wrong. If you're writing a theme study, you're writing about Huck, and maybe some of this will help with your paper. Society stifles your conscience. That's what we learn in this book. Society stifles your conscience. If the majority say something bad is good, you're likely to believe it eventually. We see that even today in 2023. If the majority of the people say something bad is good, eventually you're going to believe it, especially if they put it all over TV. Society is corrupt because mankind is corrupt. Without spiritual direction, people are always bad. Twain doesn't think you need religion to be moral. He thinks people ruin people. So very Freudian. He prefers to choose truth on his own. Society stifles freedom, so he makes Huck a free boy. Manners, restrictive clothing, religion, all stifle freedom. So Huck respects none of those things. Twain doesn't trust society. He doesn't believe you need religion to be moral. So Huck makes fun of church and hypocritical Christians. Although born and raised in Missouri, Twain vehemently opposed slavery. He witnessed the inhumane treatment of Blacks and openly criticized the barbaric institution of slavery. Here, he's shown with his lifelong friend, John Lewis, probably the pattern for Jim. In conclusion, what do we see? We're almost done here. In conclusion, Twain's realism in literature. Huck learns to break away from society's norms. He develops his own conscience. He has a natural sense of right and wrong. One who is alienated from society can figure out right and wrong more easily, thought Twain. Get out of society, because society teaches that Blacks are inferior and slavery is right. And Huck discovers the opposite. You can use any of that in your paper if you want. In our Dover text, pages 161, Huck writes a letter to Miss Watson. He will tell her where Jim is, and his conscience pricks him. And he finally decides, and this is the climax of the story on page 162 and 62. And he says, all right then, I'll go to hell. And he resolves to steal Jim out of slavery. That's the climax of the story. Okay, Huckleberry Finn exposes the cruelty, the hypocrisy of slavery through the ignorance of Huck and the character Jim. They just do what's right, and they both morally know what's right. Jim is a father. He's a husband. He befriends Huck at his own peril. He's the closest thing Huck has to a father figure. And Jim's character challenges every racial stereotype that was common in American literature previously. Twain uses a vernacular and regional dialects. This had never been done before. The characters are presented speaking just like they would have spoken. This established use of the vernacular as a unique American style in literature and influenced generations of writers, perhaps you too. Huck's personal journey to manhood highlights a person's responsibility to consult their conscience in a world filled with hypocrisy and Darwinian lies. Huck is a noble savage in some ways. One wonders if Mark Twain and Harriet Beecher Stowe ever sat down to talk. They both lived in Hartford, Connecticut for a time and must have met at various social or literary functions. Although raised in a religious family, Twain rejected organized religion, just like people do today. Well, I don't like organized religion. It's full of hypocrites. And he lived his life admiring some of the teachings of Jesus, but rejected the supernatural, so all the miracles, and most of what we would call proper theology. And that's the end of today's lesson. I will see you next week. Remember, and bring your books as listed in your schedule. And may the Lord bless you. Thank you much. Lord bless you.